Greetings to you. I'm Timothy Muse, lead pastor here at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Alliance, Ohio. It's a joy to be with you today as we spend time on the third session in the book of Romans. I pray that these sessions have been helpful for you so far to understand and grasp what Paul is doing here in this incredible and very complex piece that he's written for the people of Rome, but really has been a piece for the entire church and for Christianity throughout the ages. As we enter into this time today, I certainly would encourage you to have a Bible before you, either a printed Bible or something on your screen so that you can follow along. You can see actually the words, you can read along with the words as I read them. It's so very important for us to make sure that we are capable and willing to read the Bible, not just think we know what it says, or even the highlights. I mean, we all have Psalm 23 and John 3:16, but there's so much more in the Bible that we want to make sure that we spend time embracing and engaging. So I would encourage you to have a Bible before you today. And you can use whatever translation or paraphrase you like. I'm working with the New Revised Standard Version, but you can use the Message or the Living Bible or the NIV or the Oxford New English. Whatever you have before you is okay. There are many different translations depending on the Greek that's being used. There's many different paraphrases. All of those are acceptable. As we study the Bible, they do give us different understandings, interpretations. And they all have their limitations too. Every Bible translation, every Bible paraphrase has its limitations as well as its benefits. The New Revised Standard Version really draws closest, I believe, to the original Greek. However, there are places where it doesn't really make sense, or they have to add words that aren't in the English. So there are places where it does struggle a little bit. The same would be true of the paraphrase. A paraphrase really brings language into the modern context, but sometimes there's language in the modern context that just doesn't fit. So know that whatever you're working with, it's going to have its benefits and it's going to have its drawbacks. It's going to have its gifts and its blind spots. Because really what we're trying to do is we're trying to take the story of God, excuse me, and then write it into a language. And the story of God is beyond language. So we are trying to contain the infinite, bring the infinite into the finite. If you will, and that's how we really talk about Jesus, is the infinite contained in the finite. Excuse me, good heavens. I hope that doesn't keep going on the entire time we're together, but that's okay if it does. So we're in the first chapter of Paul's letter to the people of Rome, the book of Romans, as it's called. And last week we got through the introduction and some of the first pieces. So we're going to keep moving on here with that introductory piece, as Paul is laying out kind of the basis of this letter. As any letter that is written, we do the same thing. We address it, we label for who it's for, and then we give greetings and we give accolades. I'm happy to be writing to you. I think of you often. I miss you, what have you, whatever you want to write. And then we get into the heart of it. Well, we're not quite in the heart of it yet. Paul is spending a great deal of time. He's spending some time kind of laying out his own identity as well. Because the people of Rome, they would have heard of him, but they probably they wouldn't have met him. I mean, maybe somebody would have met him on a travel, but Paul had never been to Rome. So he's really kind of laying out his credibility as well. And as I had mentioned before, Paul is the former Christian murderer Saul. He was on a path to destroy the Christian church before Christ converted him on the road to Damascus. So there may be a lot of people that feel kind of an ambivalence, they're not sure, because this is Paul, who's this great protector, this great proclaimer and evangelist, but also this was Saul the murderer. Is this some kind of plot? Is this some kind of way for, is this some kind of ancient CIA operation to get Paul into the ranks of the Christians to find out who's in charge and then wipe them out? We as a species, we as humans have always been suspicious, and I think suspicion certainly does benefit us. If we just jump into things with blind faith, then that certainly is it can lead to wonderful things, but terrible things. We've always been suspicious as a people. Excuse me. So Paul needs to lay out his credibility. Paul needs to make sure that the people who are reading this truly grasp that he is a believer and that he can be trusted and that his words have meaning. We here in the modern church, we here in 2021, we've got 2,000 years of church history to see that Paul was faithful to the end. And though it's not in the Bible, the story is told that Paul was beheaded in Rome for his witness to Jesus Christ. But in the time of Paul's writings, the story hadn't been finished yet. So people may have been questioning. They may not have been sure. So Paul needs to lay out his credibility, and Paul needs to lay out his understanding of how God is revealed, and he wants to connect everything through. Remember, I talked last time that Paul proclaims Jesus as being of the line of David, which is really important because that connects, in verse 3, the gospel concerning his son who was descended from David according to the flesh. So that connects Jesus back to the Old Testament. And Paul is going to draw even deeper into the Old Testament because Paul doesn't believe that God had not been faithful in the Old Testament. Paul believes that God had done everything God needed to do in the Old Testament for the people to believe, but the people chose not to. And we're going to see a little bit more about that as we go deeper. So we're in chapter 1. We're starting at verse 16 today. So chapter 1, Paul's letter to the Romans, we're at verse 16. And Paul says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jews first and also the Greeks. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faith, for faith. As it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith." Okay, so a couple of important statements that Paul makes here that may have gone overlooked. First, he says, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel." I am not ashamed of the gospel. The gospel, as Paul uses it, is the good news. That's what gospel means, good news. And the particular good news that Paul is proclaiming or talking about here is the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So Paul says, I'm not ashamed of it. Now, at first we might think, well, why would you be ashamed of it? Well, when we think of being ashamed of something, we think of holding on to a belief or a thought or something that isn't accepted by society. We may want to keep it quiet, or we may want to hide it. That's what shame is, an action that causes us a feeling that wants us to hide it. And in the ancient world, in Rome, hiding the gospel, hiding your faith structure would have been something that all Christians would have done, because you would have died for it. Christianity in the ancient world was in Rome. People died for it. They were murdered. They were martyred because of the Christian faith. So it would look like, hey, I'm only going to talk about this in private. I'm only going to talk about those people that I trust. I'm not going to put this out to the world. I'm going to talk about it with people whom I trust. Well, Paul's not that way. Paul doesn't feel any shame or any drawback for the gospel. He is fully embedded, fully committed. And so he's going to speak about it whenever, wherever, to whomever. And he is not concerned. Here's the big thing. Paul is not concerned about dying. Paul is not concerned about giving up his life for the gospel. Now, that does not mean that Paul is on a suicide mission to go ahead and just stand before the Roman emperor and be executed. There's a big difference. There's a big difference between intentionally putting yourself in harm's way for the sake of the gospel and not being afraid of dying for the gospel. Paul is not afraid to die for the gospel. Paul sees that the good news of Jesus Christ is worth dying for. It is worth sacrificing one's life for. Paul sees that the good news of Jesus Christ is worth giving everything for. And so he is willing to die for the gospel. Paul is willing to die for the sake of God. Again, not that he wants to, not that he's on a suicide mission, but he is willing to die for the gospel. So he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. I'm not ashamed of it. This isn't something I'm going to hide or bury in a crevice or hope that I find, excuse me, Hope that I find Christians before I say it. Paul's going to say it. Paul's going to talk about the gospel. He's going to talk about Jesus. And if that leads to a conversion, awesome. If it leads to his execution, well then so be it. Paul is not going to hide his faith. Now here's the fascinating thing that I see. Paul lives in a world where his faith could kill him. And he's not afraid to share it. He doesn't hide it. But we in the modern world, we live in a free country. We're allowed to, we have the freedom of religion. I mean, we've got, a cross on the front of the building and our name out there and all of that. But yet there's an embedded shame that we have as modern Christians. There's an unwillingness to share our faith with others. There's a lack of boldness. And actually, for most people, when they see someone who is bold in sharing their faith, it bothers them. They're a Jesus freak. They're a zealot. They're a nut. They're a Bible thumper. Well, Paul would have been considered a Bible thumper, a zealot, a nut, a Jesus freak, because he was not ashamed of it. He willingly showed it. And he's speaking this to Rome, to the Christians in Rome, because there's probably a lot of shame in believing in Jesus. It's against the law. People have died for it. So, when we think of shame, we think of we've done something bad, and then it's that emotional cascade of guilt and anger and frustration and impatience with ourselves for doing these bad things. I don't think that's how Paul uses the word shame. Paul uses the word shame more in the idea of hiding something that we shouldn't hide. There's nothing wrong or guilty about proclaiming Jesus Christ, about believing in the gospel, even though it was against the law in Rome. It was against the law in Rome, but that doesn't mean it's against the law of God. The Roman Empire doesn't set the laws of God any more than the Constitution of the United States sets the laws of God. God sets the laws of God. And so to believe in Jesus Christ and to proclaim and witness, that's not something to be ashamed of. That's not something to hide. And we in our world don't have to hide it. It may lose us some friends. It may lose us some people that like to hang out with us, but they don't want to hear about this Jesus fellow. Well, then that's the price that you pay. You either keep your friends or you keep your Savior. But Paul's not afraid of Jesus. And why is that? Paul's very clear. He says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to anyone who has faith. Not just that it's rebellious, not just that it's a really cool story, not just that it speaks about a really cool guy. The gospel is the power of God for salvation to anyone who has faith. So the power of God for salvation, that's why he's not ashamed of it. And salvation is not a this world thing. As long as we live in this world, we live under the condemnation of our sin. But salvation comes post-mortem, after death. And so the gospel, the story of the gospel, the story of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus is the power of God for the salvation for those who have faith. So why should Paul be ashamed of it? This is the way that people are going to live forever. This is the way that people are going to gain access to God. Why should they be afraid of it? Why should he be ashamed of it? He should want everybody to hear it. He and we should be willing to die to make sure that this story is told. That's a fascinating thing. I've worked in the church for a long time. I've seen people leave the church for many reasons. Color of carpet, volume of hymnody, or volume of organ, or choice of hymns, or who gets to sit where. I've seen people walk away from the faith. For some have some pretty legitimate, not necessarily good, but legitimate reasons, and some just because they're not getting what they want. But the fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, the story of the gospel is the only way to show God's power for salvation through faith. So, to make sure that this story is told, even at the expense of one's life, should be an act of faith. Again, this is not to say that the Christian needs to go out and willingly put themselves in harm's way. But this is to say that if a Christian finds himself in a place where either speak the gospel or experience harm, if they're silent so they don't experience harm, then they're ashamed of the gospel. Paul says, I'm not going to do that. Because this is the power of God for salvation, for those who have faith. And how are you going to have faith? Unless someone tells you. Faith isn't something that's just naturally born inside of us. Faith is fostered, it's grown. We all have faith in something, but we're taught to have faith in it. So Paul is saying, I'm not ashamed of this. Romans, don't be ashamed of it either. Again, don't put a cross on your front door. That's just calling down trouble. But if the Holy Spirit moves you to speak, then speak. Speak. So, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith. To the Jews first, then also to the Greeks. So Jews and Greeks, Jews and Gentiles. So really, in a lot of ways, Paul intermingles the word Greek and Gentile. Because for a long time, that's all there was Jews and Greeks. If you were Jewish, there was your kind and the Greeks, because the Greeks were in power. So, and also, the Greeks really don't have a very high standing in the world at this time. So if it's good enough for the Greeks, it's good enough for everybody else. And I'm not Greek bashing here, folks. That's just where it was in history. The Romans were the ones that defeated the Greeks and started taking over. And the Greeks didn't have a great reputation. And so if the power of the gospel was good enough for the Greeks, it was good enough for everybody else. And it's important for me to say this. Now, Paul says, first to the Jews, then and also to the Greeks. That is not a statement to say that a Jewish Christian is better than a Greek Christian. That is not to say that if you want to be a better Christian, you need to be a Jew first. This is not about first and then also as better than and then less than. This is purely about timeline. Jesus was born a Jew. He grew up in a Jewish household. He taught to Jewish people. Rarely do we see anything in the scriptures about Jesus encountering a Gentile. As a matter of fact, the early church, like I said before, the early church thought that you had to be a Jew before you could be a Christian. So this is not about the Jews are more important, though they are still the people of God and will always be the people of God. No, it is just about timeline, because the story of Jesus Christ was exposed first to the Jews, because it's a Jewish story. It's a Christian story that was in a Jewish circumstance. Christ is a Jew. Jesus is a Jew. He was born a Jew and raised a Jew. So the story of his life, death, and resurrection is exposed first to the Jews, but then also to the Greeks, to everybody. This is not a story that is meant for one group of people. This is a story that's meant for everybody. Everybody benefits from it. For in it being the gospel, for in it, the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith. As it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith. So the righteousness of God, God's righteousness, God's rightness, that's what righteousness means, rightness. God's rightness is revealed not through law, not through commandment, not through divine intervention, not through some kind of huge mass hysteria, but through faith. For faith. So faith is the avenue of righteousness. Faith. Faith being the structure that grasps that which cannot be, that which is bigger than ourselves and cannot be explained by our empirical knowledge. So the righteousness of God is through faith for faith. It is revealed through faith for faith. The only way that we can receive the righteousness of God is through faith. Because the righteousness of God, the rightness of God is so big, so massive, and so complete that the only way that we can truly grasp it is to just purely believe it. And that's hard to do sometimes. I mean, here we are right now in the midst of a pandemic. We've been talking about this now for a while, obviously. And to have faith in a God of righteousness who would allow a pandemic, who would allow millions to die across the globe, who would allow economies to fall. That same God who would allow that which we see on the news every day. In order for us to be able to grasp that that God who allows those awful things to happen in the midst of his creation to be righteous is a leap of faith. It's an act of faith. Because if we had to have empirical evidence about the righteousness of God, we'd never find it. Never find it. No amount of tulip fields and fruit trees will ever overcome some of the awful that we as humans have perpetrated on each other and the world. We've been allowed to do it. And so how does one grasp the righteousness of God without a leap of faith? I mean, come on, God's creation actually killed God. They didn't like what he was saying, what he was doing. How can we grasp a righteous God any other way than a leap of faith? That's the only way we can do it, is by having that leap of faith, by having that faith, grasping it. And is revealed through faith for faith. So the righteousness of God is revealed through faith. But it is revealed through faith so that our faith and the faith of others can grow. So I, through my faith, have had the righteousness of God revealed to me. I can't prove it to you or to anybody else. I can tell the story and I can reveal what I've been revealed, but ultimately it will be a leap of faith for you. Every one of us has to have our own faith. We cannot piggyback on the faith of another. We cannot expect entrance into salvation because my parents believed or my grandparents believed. I have to have my own structure and level of faith. I can't rely on someone else's any more than anyone else can rely on my level of faith. It doesn't work that way. Faith is individualistic. It is communal. We grow our faith together, but at the end of the day, we don't rely. It's not each other's faith that's going to get us in. It's our own. So the righteousness of God is revealed through faith, for faith. I have had the righteousness of God revealed to me through my faith, and I'm able to use my faith to share it with others who then will come into that faith of their own accord. There's no magic pill. There's no magic pill. You know, we look at one of the one of the big debates that's going on right now around us. The vaccine is a big debate, and I'm not entering into that. But one of the questions that's been asked, and I think epidemiologists have pretty much answered, is if if I have the vaccine, or actually I'll be a little bit more specific. If a woman has a vaccine, and then either she is pregnant or gets pregnant, the question was, will that vaccine then transfer in utero to their children? Well, epidemiologists mostly feel no, it won't. So they need their own vaccine when the time comes. There might be some antibodies built up, but they will need to have their own vaccine. Faith is pretty much the same way. A child can't depend on their parents' faith. They learn from it, but at some point they have to grasp their own. And that is when the righteousness of God is revealed. All right, so carrying on, verse 18 here now. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness of those who by their wickedness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling a mortal human being, or birds, or four-footed animals, or reptiles. Okay, so Paul is moving here kind of in a broad sweep understanding. So it would ask the question, okay, so the righteousness of God is revealed for through faith, for faith? What about those who don't know God? What about these Romans? What about these people? You know, what's going to happen to them? Why should I believe a God who is all powerful and all incredible and all omnipotent? Why should I believe in that God while I'm living under oppression in a kingdom or an empire that will execute me if I proclaim that God's name? Why is that? What's going on? Why should I believe in a God who's all just and all loving while kids are starving? Why should I believe in a God that's all loving and all knowing while people are murdering people? These are the age-old faith questions. They always have been and they always will be. As long as sin remains in the world, these questions will be asked because sin taints God's world. Okay, so Paul begins to answer it, and he's going to answer it more fully as we go on, but Paul begins to answer it. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness, for those who by their wickedness suppress the truth. So God's wrath is going to pour forth on those who know the truth and turn against it. See, there's a difference. God's not going to punish the ignorant. Ignorant being lack of knowledge. Okay? And when I use the word ignorant, I use it far different than, many people want to think ignorant and stupid are the same word. I don't see that. Ignorant is lacking knowledge. Very smart people can be ignorant. There's a lot of things I'm ignorant about. Not because I'm stupid, but because I just don't have the knowledge of it. Either because I've never been exposed to it or I haven't needed the knowledge of it. Okay, that's ignorance. So there are those who are ignorant of God's work. Well, they're a separate category. Because God's not going to punish the ignorant. That's not fair. When you truly don't know, it's not fair to be punished for something you truly don't know about. But the wrath of God is poured forth from heaven for those who know. For those who by their wickedness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. So this is where Paul is going to go back. Now, Paul's understanding, Paul's belief is that God's love and God's grace and God's presence and God's righteousness has been revealed to people throughout generations. The law, the prophets, the judges, creation, the fruits, the resources, all of those, they're not just by some universe accident. They are provided as a sign of God's righteousness. And when we can see them as righteous, when we can see all of them as signs of God's righteousness, we get a fuller encapsulation and picture of what God is doing in the world. When we only look to see God in a very minute area, such as the poor, the hungry kids. Okay, let's use that. How can I believe in a God who allows hunger in the world? Well, God doesn't allow hunger. God has given the world the resources to feed everybody. It's human greed that creates hunger. But God also creates the tulips and the fruit trees and the food we eat. So there's a place where it's not about God allowing. It's almost like God sitting up there going, "Yep, I get it. I'm allowing it. I'll allow that." Like God's a big judge. Objection, Your Honor. Nope. Overruled. I'll allow it. No. But God knows that humans, us, we're filled with greed. And good people can suppress the truth. Good people can act in wicked ways. And if God were to come and swipe down, let's say that tomorrow, God is going to come down and swipe away all the wickedness in the world. Be awesome, right? You just better hope tomorrow you decide not to be wicked. So if you decide not to be wicked, well, think about all the systems you're involved in and all the systemic sin that you're involved in and hope that God doesn't see that. We're all involved in some systemic level of sin. Put gas in your car, there you go. Drink coffee this morning, there you go. Put clothes on that aren't made in the United States, there you go. All of those could be seen as signs of suppressing the truth. I put on a shirt that's made in China, and I put it on, And I bought it because it's relatively inexpensive, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of money on a shirt, so I'm buying a shirt for $12 or $15. How do I get a shirt for $12 or $15 that's shipped all the way across the world? Because it's being made for pennies by people who aren't being paid a fair wage, and there's a suppression of the truth. So when we talk about this, it's really, really complicated. We want to think that sin and wickedness is black and white. It is not. So the wrath of God now, and Paul's pretty clear about the ungodliness and wickedness. So we can be godly and still dabble in wickedness, not because we want to be wicked, but because that's part of our sinful identity. But the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness for those who by their wickedness suppress the truth. And Paul would be writing directly to kind of the Roman ideology, the Roman understanding. That these people know, Paul is saying that these people know that there is a God. That they stem from a heritage that talks about a singular monotheistic God. They've been exposed to it. And maybe even those who knew God but have turned away because they don't want to get thrown in jail. They're buying into the Roman culture. What about those Christians that were Christians but have bought into the Roman culture? What about them? They know the truth, but they suppress it in wickedness. Wickedness being intentional acts against the divine. Being silent in the face of oppression, that would be considered wickedness. Being silent when the gospel needs to be proclaimed, that would be considered wickedness. For what can be known about God is plain to them. That would be the entire earth. That would be the righteousness of creation. That would be the righteousness of sustaining life. Because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his eternal plan and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made. So for Paul, all of creation, everything that is in creation, are signs of God's grace, of God's righteousness. All of them are signs of God's giftedness to the world. That God has left these marks all over the world. We can choose to see them or not see them, depending on where we are mentally, intellectually, thought process-wise. But all of them are signs of God's work in the world, if we choose to see them. If we choose to see God's presence and God's love and God's righteousness, they're there. They're not hidden. God doesn't hide them. And he's saying, look, anybody who suppresses the truth, they can't say, well, if God's here, then God should sit down and show himself to us. Well, he is. In a loving neighbor, in a gesture, in the beauty of creation. That's where God shows us. God doesn't show up in some divine chariot. If he did, we wouldn't believe it. I think we're hallucinating. God shows up in those who don't act in wickedness, but act in truth. So they are without excuse. For though they knew God, they did not honor him as God, or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking. So there's the thing. Remember I talked before about being ignorant. Ignorance is an excuse. I never knew God. I didn't know that you existed. I thought that everything cropped up from whatever. There's a lot of creation myth, creation stories out there. I didn't know God. That's an excuse. But knowing and then turning one's back, there's no excuse for that. You can't be excused for it. If you're going to do that, then you need to be prepared to take the punishment for it. And that still is true today. That still is true today. My brothers and sisters, I'll be clear. We all lead busy lives. We all have things going on. We all have got scheduling conflicts all over the place. But that's not an excuse. That's not an excuse to daily grow your relationship with God. That's not an excuse to turn away from honoring and worshiping God. Paul says there's no excuse. If you know this God, then there is no excuse So don't look for one. Stop trying to find one. You're not going to find it. And Paul's trying to make it very clear here. You know, again, and I've talked about this a lot. We in our identity, we've kind of created this thing where there's a middle ground of faith. You're in, you're out, yeah, you're kind of in the middle. That's not how God works. You're either striving for the kingdom or you're turning your back on the kingdom. And doing nothing is turning your back on the kingdom. Allowing other things to get in the way of a daily prayer life, of a daily scripture life. And again, you don't have to spend 4 hours a day on your knees in prayer. We're not all Martin Luther here. But to daily talk to God, to daily read God's word, to do some kind of devotional, have some kind of quiet time to listen for God, to work to grow this relationship. We know that that's what we need to do. We know because that's what we've been taught, because that's what the scriptures tell us. So there is no excuse if we don't do it when we stand before God and God says, hey, what's up? Well, no, there's no excuse. There was no excuse for them. Maybe they turned away from God. Maybe they honor God with their lips, but their hearts are far from them, as Isaiah said. So Paul says, look, they knew God. They did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking. But I tell you how powerful that hits home. Knew God, but didn't honor him as God. I hear a lot of people say they knew God, but I question how many honor him as God. I know who God is, but is God God? Or is God just some really cool entity that gives me what I want? Or something to be mad at because I'm not getting what I want? To know God, but not honor him, is what draws down the wrath from heaven. That's what Paul says. That's where we're at. And I wouldn't disagree with that. I wouldn't disagree with that. Jesus says there's one unforgivable sin, and that's the sin against the Holy Spirit. Sin against the Holy Spirit is to know Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior and intentionally turn away from him. To know God, but not honor him, that's an intentional turning away. Very different than not knowing God. It's one thing to not know, it's another thing to know and intentionally turn away. So they're without excuse. Whoever they are, whoever Paul is imagining they are, whether it is the Romans, whether it is those who were part of the fellowship and turned away because they didn't want to sacrifice their life, or life in Rome turned out to be really, really good. I mean, we're going to talk about life in Rome. And life in Rome, yeah, Rome had a lot going on. I mean, you know, they call Las Vegas Sin City. No, in a lot of ways, Las Vegas would have been a monastery compared to Rome. So they know God, but they've turned away. They did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking. Futility is thinking that has an end. Their senseless minds were darkened. So futility, they were thinking in ways that weren't going to prosper. And their senseless minds were darkened. They had given up on their senses. Think about, you give up on your senses. You give up on your sense of sight. Close your eyes. Someone else is telling you what's in front of you, rather than open your eyes and see for yourself. You give up your ears, so you can't hear. So someone else is informing you somehow what's going on. It's like, you know, someone else writing out a Mozart piece rather than hearing it itself. So their senses had become darkened. They stopped thinking for themselves and following their faith. They started following whatever was being fed them. And it wasn't God. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. And they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling a mortal human being or birds or four-footed animals or reptiles. So they turned from wisdom to foolishness. They turned from revelation and faith to idol worship. That's what Paul's talking about here. And Rome was big on idol worship. Romans had idols all over the place. There was a god for everything. The Romans were polytheistic. They had gods for everything. And every god had a statue or a curio. So people had all these curios in their house. These little altars with all these different curios. And if it wasn't raining, then you pull out the goddess of rain and you pray to her. If you're getting ready to go to war, then you pull out the god of war. Or you're hungry, you pull out the god of food, whatever. And all these different gods had different images. And so Paul is seeing this senselessness, this shadowing, this darkening of the mind. People are no longer striving for the righteousness of God. And I would imagine that Paul probably could go back centuries before Christ to see this happening. This was not an overnight thing. This was a slow process that happened over time. We see all throughout the Old Testament kings, I'm thinking King Ahab and Jezebel, turning away from God and bowing down to other gods, other leaders, other promises, other idols. Well, idol worship is something that's huge in the Roman Empire. And really, quite frankly, if you were a true Roman, you had idols in your house. So how do you exist in the Roman Empire and maintain not getting executed? Well, but Paul says, look, there's a wrath waiting for them. They're not going to get away with it. That wrath is going to pour forth from heaven, and it's going to consume them. We as people, we like immediate retribution, and it's really hard when we don't get it. But Paul's saying, hey, stay the course. Hold your faith. That wrath will come, just not the way you want it to, just not what you think. Therefore, God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the degrading of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the Creator, the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Excuse me. So this is the conclusion. Whenever we have a therefore statement. So Paul talks about what's going on around them. And any good Christian in Rome would have been seeing all this going, yep, this is all going on. How do we hold on to this God who's letting all this happen? Yep, that's happening. Yep, that's happening. Yep, that's happening. What's God going to do about it? God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity. Is that punishment? Not in this world. In this world, that's not punishment at all. That'd be awesome to be, given up to the lust of our impurities. The problem is that giving up takes away the road to salvation. God is no longer pressing on them the gift, the role, the blessedness of salvation. God is not protecting them. And I really think, I really think this is an important vision. It's something I want you to hold on to. We all, as sinful human beings, we have, the lust of our hearts. Maybe it's physical lust or money lust or the lust to beat somebody down or the lust to say something. There's something, we're not pure. We're not pure. So how do we as people of faith live in an impure world? We live there because God protects us. God protects us from the lust of our hearts. That's the power of the Holy Spirit. That's the gift of the community, the gift of the Word. God protects us from the lust of our hearts. Through many and various ways. God puts a hedge of protection around us against our own lust, against our own desires. If God took that away, if God said, you know what, I'm just going to let you deal with your own lusts and desires. I'm going to let them overwhelm you. You'd be lost. Our life would be in ruin. We'd be lost. And we would lose the path to salvation. So this may not look like a benefit, but it is. This may not look like a benefit for those who are striving. It is a benefit for those who are striving. For those who have given up, this is truly a punishment. They may have a great couple of years, but when they're done, what is to come isn't going to be great. It's going to be terrible, actually. But God has revealed that. God has spoken about that. And they don't want to listen. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator. And what creature did they worship and serve? Themselves. They worshiped and served themselves. Self-idolatry is the greatest form of idolatry and the form of idolatry that we face the most. We idolize ourselves. I want what I want and God should answer me. Well then, if that's the case, who's God? Me or God? I am. If God should do what I say, well then I'm God and God is not. Self-idolatry is one of the biggest things that we fight against. And in our modern world, self-idolatry is celebrated. It's very hard to combat because we want to think that our narrative is the narrative. And we bring that to just about everything. Families, schools, work, faith communities, our narrative. My narrative is our narrative. No, God's narrative is our narrative. But when we enter into this self-idolatry, which is what Paul is talking about here, pleasures of the flesh, pleasures of the moment, living for the right now and not in some kind of mindful, empowered way, but in a I want it and I want it now. Very much a Veruca Salt sort of way from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. But God is going to let them be. God's not going to punish them for their action. They'll probably wind up punishing each other. You live into the lust of your hearts, usually sooner or later you have bad things happen to you. But then also, the avenue of salvation is not open to them because they've turned away from the truth and lived in wickedness. They've served the creature themselves rather than the Creator, the one who made them. So they make the self-God and God the manservant or the maidservant or the butler or the divine concierge or what have you. And that's not who God is. That's not who God is. All right, my friends, we're going to break here for now. Lots of stuff in there, But we're going to break here for now, and we'll pick it up next time, session 4. As always, my contact information comes up at the end of the session. If you have any questions or what have you, feel free to reach out to me. I'll do the best I can to answer them. If I can't reach out to you directly, or I'll try to draw them into the next session and make sure that we're all on the same page. And trust me, your question, if you have a question and you think nobody else wants to know, somebody else might want to know. So if you got a question, ask it. I'll do what I can to answer it for you. Hey, God bless you. God bless you all. Have a great day, a wonderful week, and we'll see you next time.